Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining. Today, we have the great having with us Adam Galinsky, who's the chair of the management division, the co-author of the best-selling book, Friend and Foe, and sought-after consultant and legal expert. His TED Talk, How to Speak Up for Yourself, has over 6.5 million views. Also, we have with us Professor Paul Ingram. He's the faculty director of Columbia's flagship residential program for senior executives from around the globe. He's the recipient of the prestigious Good Prize and consults on issues of leadership and organizational design and strategy to leading companies in the finance, healthcare, insurance, energy, arts, education, and consumer products industries. Paul has received the Dean's Award for Teaching Excellence, won the Commitment to Excellence Award, and voted by graduating EMBA students 5 times. I can attest to it myself. He got my vote, and he had a profound influence on my professional identity. I'm the CEO and co-founder of Applicaster. It's a venture-backed software as a service company operating in the intersection of media and technology, and it's based out of New York. We have offices in London, Tel Aviv, Miami, and San Jose, and a team of about 100 professionals. As many of you, we've been facing the challenge of being strategic through this crisis. And I want to start off by asking Adam, how do you see the role of the leader, especially during a crisis like this?
Thanks so much, everyone, for being here. And thanks so much for Jonathan for hosting and Paul for being here. COVID-19 is clearly the crisis of the century. And when faced with any crisis, especially one marked by uncertainty, people immediately gravitate towards leaders to divine a path forward. But here's the problem. When leaders fail to provide that guidance, people feel powerlessness. And what they start to do psychologically, and this is what my research shows, is they start to fill that void with conspiracies, with superstitions, which only fuels this loss of control and a sense of panic. And more panic is the last thing we need right now. So what I've been doing over the last 20 years is I've been really thinking about what is a leader. And I've developed a model of leadership that I call the actor-architect model of leadership. And basically what I've surmised is that we can really think of leaders as comprising 2 different roles. First, leaders are actors. And as actors, they're essentially a person on stage. You can bring up the actor part now, great. And when someone's on stage, just think of a Broadway play, right? All eyes are on them. And then their actions start to send signals to other people and affects the way that they feel inside. So a Broadway actor can move an audience to tears or to laughter or to thought or to fear or to excitement or to passion. In the same way, a leader is on stage. People are looking to leaders and they are affected by their behavior. Everything they say gets amplified. So takeaway architect first, sorry. We're going too far. What you really need to understand as a leader is that you are on stage, people are looking at you, and what you say, what you do, how you act, how you interact with others is changing how they feel inside, how they think. But there's a second thing that leaders are, and leaders are also architects. And what I mean by that is if you think about any architect, right? An architect designs space to affect the type of reactions people have, the interactions they have, where they go, their behaviors, et cetera. In the same way, when a leader is an architect, they are designing policies and procedures that are supposed to open up the right channels to lead people in a particular direction and close off the wrong channels that lead people in error. And so what they're doing is they're guiding people. Now, these actors come in lots of different forms. Sometimes it comes in how we create the right team of experts to be able to guide our decision making. Sometimes it comes in a policy that motivates people. Sometimes it comes in a policy that protects people. But the key thing to know is that all leaders are essentially actors on a stage and architects. And this is especially true in a crisis. And I know Paul has had a lot of thoughts about this too, and I'm going to turn it over to him to talk about the role of strategy in a crisis.
Thanks, Adam. Thanks, John, and everybody. I want to pick up on Adam's observations about actors and architects, and I want to talk first about the leader as an architect in a moment of crisis. What does it mean to be an architect? Well, I think really it's to create a strategy and put in place the structures for implementing the strategy. And I want to focus at this moment on the significance of creating and communicating strategy during a crisis. I think this is really one of the things, whether you're a CEO of an organization, leading a department, leading a team, one of the things I'd like you to think about is the responsibility and the necessity of offering a strategy to people you're leading. What does this mean? Well, actually, it doesn't have to be complicated. It should be simple. I would suggest that you have to identify a small set, perhaps 4 key priorities for success for the people you're leading during the crisis. Ideally, they would be in order, but the principles when they face choices, when they're making trade-offs, the principles that they should be pursuing. So you got to create the crisis strategy and communicate it. Beyond just making you aware of that, I'd like to offer you a tool. And it's a tool that may help you generate a more effective and robust crisis strategy. So I'd like you to have a way, if we could go to the next slide, please, have a way to think about uncertainty at a moment of crisis. And what I'm showing you here is a snapshot from an exercise I engaged in recently on scenario planning. Actually, this was part of developing a crisis strategy for a top management team. Now, what scenario planning allowed you to do is to think about the most relevant dimensions of uncertainty for your organization. Now, in this case, with this company, given where they sit in the economy, the key levels of uncertainty for them were the big ones about the effect of COVID-19 on the healthcare system and on financial markets. But for you, the dimensions of uncertainty could be when does construction restart in upstate New York? Or when and what numbers will people feel comfortable traveling by air again, right? But the point is to think about the key uncertainties in terms of how your organization would effectively respond and give them color and start to think about what would be ideal responses in those spaces. Now, I want to emphasize that scenario planning is not an exercise in trying to predict the future. I don't think we should engage in that exercise at a time of crisis when uncertainty is so high. It's not making bets on the future, but instead it's trying to identify the space of feasible worlds that might come into being. And the possibility of that, if we could go to the next slide, is that by thinking about possible worlds, you have the chance to identify the commonalities between them. And that could allow you to come up with a more robust strategy, right? So you think about the key levels of uncertainty for your organization. You describe what the intersection between those dimensions would be like. You think about opportunities and threats and how you would succeed. And there's a possibility, and in fact, in some sense, I would predict that it's likely that you're going to discover that for some of these possible worlds, the best responses, the priorities for your organization response are going to be the same, right? So you can zero in on some elements of a crisis strategy that are going to be robust and in a sense, position yourself to respond to uncertainty without any unrealistic expectation that you're going to be predicting exactly what the world is going to look like. Right? So my message is have a crisis strategy, make it one that is robust to the uncertainty that is unfolding before us to the extent that that's possible. Now let's turn it over to somebody who's actually leading in the middle of this crisis. John, could we hear your responses to Adam's perspective?
Thanks, Paul. You know, it was interesting that you said about scenarios about predicting the future, because I think that what we found we're dealing with is we didn't have the capabilities to understand the present, because the present was unfolding so quickly before our eyes, and we couldn't understand what was happening with our own data sets. So the exercise we went through in the company was really to rewire all of our inputs and everything that we're looking at so that we can even start devising strategies and scenarios. So I think one of the first things, and Adam, you spoke about, about architecting. I needed to create the stages. We didn't have any stages. We went remote, completely remote. There was no informal communication. I think that was the biggest thing that was hit, because we use Zoom a lot. We use conferencing quite a bit, but all the informal communication went away, and I had to bring that back in some way. So we created a lot of new formats in the company, a lot of new types of meetings for bigger teams to come together, look at data, and think about it together. We brought our sales, marketing, and product team together to one kind of growth team meeting, and we do that twice a week. And part of the stuff that we've added to those meetings are new kinds of measurements that we wanted to put in place. So one thing that I wanted to give like the participants as a tip, the first thing I did was understand our tooling was wrong, that we had to switch over from Google Meet to Zoom because you can't see the people you're talking to when you're showing a presentation on Google Meet. And that's so important. I mean, right now that we're sitting, the three of us looking at each other, that's a lot. And Google Meet, you're presenting a presentation. Once you're presenting a presentation, you can't see the others. I just concluded a fundraising process last week, and I had to sit in a room with a partnership of 6, 7 investors. And if I couldn't see their faces and read their reactions, I wouldn't have been able to deliver as efficiently or as effectively. So that was one thing, and that's a tip I recommend. No endorsement to Zoom, but Google Meet had that big disadvantage. And then what we did was, in that growth meeting, we discovered that we're tracking quantitative measures, but not enough qualitative measures. And what we added was a field. We had to go into our Salesforce, into all our mechanisms, and add a field. We wanted to have our people go out into the industry and ask about the response to coronavirus, to the crisis, and get data in real time and review it weekly. And we've got a lot of stuff from customers in the industry we talk to. I mean, let's get in touch when the world is back to normal. This continues longer for 2 months. It's going to impact different kinds of reactions. But what we were able also to find were like also the places where it actually worked. So we found that in the magazine industry, COVID canceled the magazines altogether and is forcing digital transformation to improve immediately. So we found where is the opportunity? Where are we actually selling, what's our toilet paper in the situation? And we refer to it that way. And I wanted to give an example. We actually had this like back and forth that was really quick. The first thing that happened is that all of our leads in the sports industry went away because sports events got canceled. The Olympics got pushed. Everything was just, and no one was willing to make any investment. So all the deals that we had in play were going away. So we quickly shifted our strategy in these growth calls, and we decided we are not going to target the sports industry right now. We're going to focus on entertainment and news, which are growing. But we kept the inputs flowing. And what we discovered a few weeks later, as news came out that sports events will resume, but without audience, that their demand for our product is actually increasing. So we were able to adjust again based on the information that we received. But it requires us to go through a lot of information very quickly in ways that we're not used to do. And the other thing that happened, we needed to change how we look at KPIs. If before we would look at our performance on a graph, as you can see on the left side, now we're looking at things within bands. Every KPI that we measure, we look at a trigger line. And we measure our performance between our desired performance and that trigger line. And we have a plan B and a plan C. So that we know that if we're performing, we hit the trigger line, we're going to shift to plan B and plan C so that we're resilient throughout this crisis. And this goes across all of our KPIs. And it delivers a lot of benefit because we can make these adjustments to our cost structure, to our investment profile, to our product strategy, based on looking at things within a bandwidth. And I think that we're going to continue to do that after this crisis is over. We're going to 100% look at contingencies and not only at a plan and how we're measuring against that plan. But I was wondering, Adam, are you able to offer us any additional techniques to inspire leadership or instill further confidence in the team?
Absolutely. So, first of all, I really just want to say one thing about what, Jonathan said, which I think is so important. And that is this idea that, in a crisis, we might learn new ways of responding that actually will be beneficial to the organization once the crisis is over. And I think part of it is recognizing, going back to Paul's point about like maybe the priorities aren't going to change in the crisis versus outside the crisis. And so recognizing what are going to be those strengths that are going to be transferable outside the crisis is really important. Earlier, I mentioned that leaders are actors on stage. And what I meant by that is that all the eyeballs are on them and they're transforming people. And I've started about 20 years ago asking people all over the world, almost every, massive numbers of countries in the world, every continent in the world, just a simple question. I asked them to tell me about a leader that changed the way they felt inside. And I wanted them to think about a particular change that happened, which was they made them feel inspired. There's something about the leader that made them feel this ineffable feeling of inspiration inside themselves. And what I've done is I've asked people to be a social scientist. And I've said to them basically this: tell me, what was it about that leader that inspired you? Was it something, what was it? Was it their behavior, their way of being in the world, the way they interacted with others? But I want you to diagnose and specify and pinpoint the core feature of what they did that inspired you. And as I mentioned, I've asked this all over the world, and I've asked tens of thousands, probably hundreds of thousands of people this question, and there's three clear insights that have emerged from this, which I think are transferable to every situation in life, crisis and non-crisis. The first thing is that the factors that make up an inspiring leader, the core features that drive, the core features that drive people are universal. They occur in every country in the world. I teach in Australia, I teach in Thailand, I do consulting in Europe and South America, all over the world. And I ask people this question, there's literally not a single attribute or element of inspiring leader that does not come up in every single country I've ever been to. The second thing is I've also asked people a second question. I've asked them, tell me about another leader that also changed you inside, but this time infuriated you. What was it about them that made your blood boil? And what I've discovered is that the archetype or the elements of an infuriating leader are the exact opposite of an inspiring leader. They exist on a continuum, on a dimension, which I'll come to in 1 second. And then third is I can do scientific analysis on everything that's ever been said about these inspiring and infuriating leaders, and I can reduce them to three core factors. An inspiring leader is visionary, they are an exemplar of inspiring behavior, and they are a great mentor. And I've given you a mnemonic device up here called the Venn diagram of inspiring leadership. And I think this really, really captures the core of what it is. So what does it mean to be visionary? Well, visionary really starts off with a big picture view of the future, right? It's that future is infused with both optimism and a sense of meaning and purpose. And then exactly what Paul said. Paul said, reduce it down to 4 priorities. What it is taking that optimistic, meaningful, big picture and distilling it into its simplest form, into its essence. And then you've got to repeat it over and over and over again. I think, Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech is the archetype of this, right? It's this big picture, optimistic, meaningful view of the future. He distills it into a very simple form of justice, and then he repeats it through his I Have a Dream statement. Now, the infuriating leader is the exact opposite of this, right? They're not optimistic. They're small-minded, right? They've made it too complex, or they never share and never repeat their thing. So to be visionary, which is incredibly crucial in a crisis, is you need an optimistic, meaningful, big picture view of the future, distill it to its simplest form, and repeat it again and again. Now, the second factor is what I call an exemplar of desired behavior. An exemplar of desired behavior, I think, is epitomized in a very old painting of George Washington crossing Delaware. If you remember this painting, where is George Washington's boat? It's the first lead boat. Where's he in that boat? He's in front of the boat. What's he doing? He's standing up in that boat. He's taking on the most risk. He is courageous and calm in that moment. So one of the core aspects of being exemplary desired behavior is being courageous and calm protector. Now, an infuriating leader, right, is cowardly and distressed, right? Another thing that really distinguishes infuriating leaders from inspiring leaders is this idea of authentic passion, this idea of showing what you really care about. And then I think the next one, which I've really studied, is this idea of competence, of being really good at your job, being super at what you do. And I think, Jonathan has really emphasized that, right? This idea of okay, we're going to solve this problem. We're going to use all we need to know, our skills that we've already developed within this company to take opportunities and to protect our downside. But here's the thing, is that we're often really moved by leaders that are also human. So I call it super but human. Now, here's one thing that's really important. You don't want to be human super. What do I mean by that? You don't want to show vulnerability and then try to act super. That vulnerability humanizes your superness, but if it comes first, it decimates your superness. And then the final thing, and this one I think is so critically important, and is probably the one that's driven me the most crazy in looking at leaders, is this idea of being consistent. And what I mean by that is consistent from day to day. It also means consistent with what you advise others to do and what you're willing to do yourself. So you're not a hypocrite, right? So I think a lot of people were very frustrated with Mike Pence not wearing a mask at the Mayo Clinic, right? This is something that the CDC has advised people to do. Everyone else is doing it, but he's not doing that. That creates an inconsistency. Now, the final element of being an inspiring leader is being a great mentor. And I think this is one that's particularly important in a crisis, right? In a crisis, how do you empower and develop others in that moment? How do you learn to let go of a little bit of control, to delegate so that other people can feel involved? And then it's also being generous and empathic, right? Finding those symbolic acts, right? Whether it's the CEO reducing their salary, right? Whether it's everyone taking a small pay cut so that you don't actually have to lay people off. Or if you do lay people off, what are you doing to help them get through that process, right? So if you want to inspire people, right, you need to be visionary, you need to be exemplary desired behavior, and you need to be a mentor. But remember, these are on a continuum. It's very easy to slide to the infuriating side of the ledger by being anxious, by being small-minded, by not sharing what you're thinking, by being hypocritical, right? By not empowering others but micromanaging, by not being generous but being self-interested rather than other-focused. And I think Paul's going to talk a little bit about some of this with, I think, some notions of humility in a crisis.
Thanks, Adam.
And
So
leading with values, too.
I really want to build on this idea about how to be a visionary, exemplary, and a leader that's also a mentor. But if that's the what of inspiring leadership, I'd like to take a step back and give you a thought about the how. If you're trying to reach the end state of the them inspiring leader, what do you do to allow yourself to represent those best practices? And I'm going to offer you a tool here. And I'm going to talk for a couple of minutes about what we know about the significance of leveraging your own values as a leader. Now, it might seem kind of interesting to think about your own values as you're trying to have a positive impact on the people you're leading. But I want to suggest to you that although leadership is about affecting others, the foundation is actually your capacity to understand and lead yourself. So that's where we're going to begin. So what I'm showing you here is a device that recent graduates of the Columbia Business School will be aware of. It's what we call a values hierarchy. So on the left, there's my own values hierarchy. It shows my top values in professional life, and it shows the connections that I see between them. But what I want to tell you about being your best leader at a moment of crisis, some of the things that we've learned about how bringing your own values to top of mind can actually improve your leadership. So that's what's on the right of this graph. We have evidence that if a leader brings her values to the top of mind, her stress goes down. Actually, cortisol, the stress hormone, which is damaging at persistent elevated levels, actually decreases. We find that leaders who bring their values top of mind are more robust in their response and more effective in their performance when they are visited by external threats. We find that leaders who know their values are more ethical. They make better connections to others, the empathy that Adam was talking about. They are more trustworthy in the eyes of the people they're leading. Right? Now, if you look at these benefits, you recognize, I think, that all of those are elements of good leadership. In fact, they're all seen in parts of Adam's VEM model. But if you look at the list, I think you'll be struck as I am that they're even more important in a moment of crisis, where the threat is higher, where the stress is higher, where the relationships matter more, where trust is more significant. Right? So my advice to you is leverage your own values. You just bring them to top of mind, and it improves your capacity to be an inspiring leadership. Now, besides just that advice, I'd like to give you a way to tap into it. So if you go to the next slide, what I'm offering you here is a little reflection that you could use to identify the values that matter most to you in a crisis. Now, I'm not going to suggest that we do the reflection in the short amount of time we have on this webinar, but you could revisit this after the webinar for a few minutes. And I think it could be useful in identifying for yourself what are the values that you want to bring to mind to be your best leader during a crisis. So the reflection asks you to think about what the crisis means, what's at stake in terms of your professional life. Reflect on the challenges and opportunities that the crisis represents, and what is most important to you in terms of what you would like as outcomes. So I did this reflection earlier today myself. And when I did the reflection, the first thing that came to my mind was family. That it's really important at this time of crisis for me to meet my own obligations to my family. I thought about creativity. Maybe that surprised me a little bit, but I find myself really hungry for the inputs to new ideas and creativity at this moment. So in the crisis, I'm reminding myself and looking for ways to pursue creativity. And then maybe not a surprising opportunity came to mind as something that was precious to me, right? But the point of this is for you to think about what matters most to you and to actually realize that in the same sense the strategy helps the organization, your values could serve as your own compass, your own direction at a moment of crisis. And the compass is most important in the midst of the chaos of the crisis. So, John, how about your experience as the leader during this crisis? What would you say about what you've tried and what you've learned in terms of leadership?
Well, I have to say that the Value Tree is probably one of my favorite experiences at CBS so far. It's a 6-hour exercise with jazz bands and whatnot, and I think that once you come to terms with your own values, it's pretty trivial because it really is what makes you tick for a large amount, I think, for a very extended period of time beforehand. So it's easy just to draw the line from there forward. And I wanted to share, like, first of all, the value tree that I created and what we've done in contrast to that, but also touch on what Adam raised, which is about consistency. I mean, there are obviously the 3 elements of the Venn diagram, but I think consistency is a big issue, which we'll touch on later, because some people, and I see also in our organization, crisis, pivot. There's something bad happening, we change our direction. We veer away from the danger. We change everything. And the reaction is too extreme. Panic, if you will. And I think that's pretty much the biggest leadership challenge right now, is to say, okay, all these things are changing, but we need to course correct, we need to fine tune, but we need to be consistent. And this is another tool that helps. So for me, at the foundation of the value tree were inventiveness and intellectualism. And what we've done with the forums that we build, we're able to be both inventive and intellectual at the same time. We sit together, the growth team, we look at all the data that we get, really open to new inputs, analyze them, and then we come up with creative ideas around them. It's a very safe, psychologically safe space. So there's a lot of generosity with listening to each other's idea and affection between the team that's been working for a long time together. But I've also created informal meetups. So there are ready to participate. It is not mandatory. So I get a different group of people every time. And that allows for more creative discussion and a greater sense of psychological safety. And I think that's something we're going to continue to do after this is over. I don't think that the idea of having scheduled meetings that aren't mandatory as a format of an all hands is something we've done before, but it's definitely a big learning from this. And I'll continue to do that 100%. I talk a lot about my family in these meetings. I do that before. I've done that before, but now in the context of what's happening, I make it a point to do it even more already, which you might. So I apologize in advance. But custom that, and you have to make it okay. So it's okay to be struggling right now. It's okay not knowing these answers. We're all human. We're all going through the same thing. And I think that most of us all find our family to be a very important thing in our life, and we care about our family, we want to protect our family. And not a lot of people, people talk about their families as well, but I think just by listening to mine, it's not about creating myself as the most important figure in the company. It just gives them a way, gives them an outlet to the anxiety they have around these issues, and makes it, it creates a deeper connection, also a value clarifying connection. And as we enjoy that connection, it creates a safe place for everybody to create in. So we have optimism and we have integrity. And we've, we've been creating growth in the most difficult time. Our pipeline is growing. The traction in the market is really good. Investors continue to support us, which we don't take for granted. So optimism and integrity are the building blocks we're using for this. So really, these personal values are the key tool I'm using to navigate this situation. But I wanted to raise that there's a sensitivity now because everybody wants to be pivoting, as I mentioned. Teams, customers, investors, everybody thinks we just have to, So if the behavior is aligned with the values, even if the actions and the strategies are considerably different, it gives you a lot of room to maneuver and maintaining a strong sense of alignment. And I think that's what I'm looking for as a leader right now. I'm looking for wiggle room. I'm looking for ways to be more flexible without it being interpreted as, oh my God, we're in a huge crisis, we have to pivot. And if we're consistent with the values, that gives us so much leeway in the choice of action. So I think that's been great. But still mistakes happen all the time. They're bound to be made. So Adam, maybe you can offer some advice on recovery.
Sure. I've thought a lot about this, about how do we recover from mistakes that we make. So think about when Starbucks had their individual crisis where they kicked out an African American from one of their stores or had them arrested. Equifax with their computer breach, Facebook, with some of their breaches. So but in a crisis we won't be perfect, and so we're going to get forecasts wrong. We're going to take these incredibly well-intentioned actions that are going to blow up in our face with unintended consequences. And because we're tired or frustrated, fatigued, we might not get the tone right when we're communicating with others. So I've created an equation that I think can help anyone do what I call Corker crisis back into its bottle. So what is this equation? We can bring up the slide. It's basically an acronym. If you can't tell by now, I like acronyms. And the first thing that you need to do is you need to be quick. When mistakes happen, you got to respond right away. You got to apologize immediately. Now, speed matters both operationally, but also symbolically. And you never want to be late. Now, we saw lots of leaders be late with the COVID crisis, maybe even just a couple days late, but that was incredibly important for the consequences for how these things have gone. Now, after you quickly, start speaking, what you want to do is you want to be completely open and candid about what you did and what happened, right? That involves factually describing what happened and not hiding the negative results that occurred. And then the third thing you need to do is you need to take responsibility. Are you bringing up? Bring up the next one, please. You need to take responsibility for those mistakes, and also be remorseful. Like show a little bit of that empathy. That's really important. Now, why is responsibility so important? Responsibility means credibility, because when you take responsibility for an action that happened or an outcome that occurred, you're making people confident that you are in control, even didn't the best thing happen. I want to just mention two studies that really highlight this. First is an analysis that was done of corporate annual reports over a 21-year period, and they found that when a negative thing happened to that organization, to that corporate entity, and in their corporate annual report, the CEO took responsibility for that negative event, their stock prices went up the next year because people saw them as in control. Similarly, what most hospitals used to do is they used to have a deny and defend for medical errors. We're going to deny they happened, we're going to defend against them. And then they started going towards something else called full disclosure. We're responsible, this is what happened. They were quick, they were open, they were responsible, they were remorseful. Their lawsuits dropped 40%. So think about that, right? So, and then the final thing is, once you've been quick, once you've been open, once you've taken responsibility, express that empathy, you got to commit to a path forward. What are you going to do different next time that's going to prevent this happening? So, for example, if a shortage happens in your supply chain, like this is what happened, here's the 2 steps we're going to take next time so that supply chain shortage doesn't happen. I'm going to ensure this is what I'm going to do next time so I treat everyone with respect, even though I lost my temper the last time. So if you respond quickly and with openness and take responsibility and chart that corrective path forward, you're not only going to survive your mistake, but you might come out in an even better position. And that's exactly what Paul talked about earlier, right? And Jonathan talked about. What are we going to do today that's actually going to make us stronger when the crisis is over. And I'm going to turn over to Paul, who's going to talk a little bit more about how do we recover from these mistakes and move forward in a time of crisis.
Thank you, Adam. So I agree that I think some of the most inspiring elements of this conversation for me have been about improving in the future. I love John's examples about changes they've discovered during the crisis that may last after the crisis. So I'd like to say something about the role of mistakes and learning, actually making improvements in the organization. And I'd like to begin by giving you two perspectives on learning that I think can help you optimize the opportunity during the crisis. The first is one that I think we could label humility. Really, it is being realistic about the potential to respond to the uncertainty that a crisis response represents. The truth of the matter is, you and the people in your organization are going to make mistakes. I think it is inevitable at a crisis. I had an interesting opportunity about a month ago, in early March, to actually lead a 3-day executive program on crisis leadership in the shadow of this emerging crisis. And there was a great moment during those discussions where there was a leader. She was head of public safety at a great global university. And at some point, when she was thinking about when you were talking about mistakes, she shrugged and she said that your decisions in a crisis will never be perfect, that mistakes are inevitable given the circumstance. And I think that that realization, it's a truth. I think it's very liberating and positive for learning. If you free yourself up from the expectation of a perfect response, you allow yourself to engage in the thoughtful experiments and the innovations that may allow for learning and better performance. If you just want to see how important that is, consider the absence of that willingness. Imagine that you were unwilling to consider or allow the possibility of a mistake in a highly uncertain situation like a crisis. Really, you'd be paralyzed. What could you do that wouldn't admit a possibility of a mistake in a very new and challenging situation, right? So my first piece of advice for learning is understand that mistakes will happen. That doesn't mean that you're embracing mistakes, but they give you the opportunity to do some discovery and create possibilities for learning. Now, the second thing I'd like to say about learning in a crisis, I think it's particularly relevant given that we are in an ongoing crisis, is the optimistic point that we learn by doing, that over time, our experience improves our performance. I spent the first few years of my research career studying what are called learning curves, which relate experience doing just about anything to performance. And I reached the conclusion that I still think it is perhaps the most robust empirical fact about human performance, that if we do something more, we get better at it. That is true for productivity in manufacturing. It's true for error rates in complicated processes. It's true for healthcare outcomes in hospital situations. We do something more and we get better at it. What this means is that whatever it is your organization is learning to do at this moment, you are better at it than you were 6 weeks ago. You can expect to be better at it in 2 weeks. And that there is this positive return to experience. So how do you grab that? I think the advice I would give you is to respect experience. Now, the last thing I'd like to say about learning is about what's unusual about the crisis context. And actually, I think it's a universal point about applying lessons from the past to future performance. John mentioned actually that in class, we use as an example to responding to uncertainty the metaphor of a jazz band. And one of the things we learn from the jazz band is that every time they go to work, they produce something new, right? That's why they're relevant to uncertainty and crisis. But we also learn about their method for doing that. And it actually involves deep practice one-on-one. So in calm moments alone, the members of a jazz band, they're practiced for thousands of hours. They learn history, scales, their craft. They really engage in deep learning by doing. But yet when they get on stage, they don't repeat what they did in those moments of practice. They don't repeat history. But instead, the experience becomes the raw material for innovation, right? So we're in a unique situation now here. Hopefully it's one that will never be revisited by anything which has quite these characteristics. But that does not mean that the lessons of this crisis are not relevant for the future. You can't take them wholesale and apply them to a different world, but the challenge will be to embrace this experience and think about the elements of it that in some new combination can be useful to us in a different world that will visit us. So let's go back to John. And John, what is the concept of mistakes and the threats and opportunities? What does that mean to you in your experience at Applicaster?
It's funny, we spoke about it also earlier. We're the result of a mistake almost. We have the eternal charter to make mistakes all the time, and we're in an existential crisis every day, all day. And I think that our charter from our startup, there's a lot of remorse that's there, or I mean, of course, you could be reflective, but the point is to grow from it. And I think where I really relate to the points both you and Adam made were about the need to be humble and quick and just open to the fact that everybody's. And one thing that I realize is that there's also a lot of opportunism, but people are recognizing that heroes are made in a time of crisis. So in the organization, you would feel a lot of people come up with ideas how we would radically change this or radically change that, and in ways that would be more aligned with their own personal view of things rather than the greater good. And as a leader, I think that's a big challenge right now, because on the one hand, I want to be very open and take in all the inputs and not bucket anything or label any kind of input that way. But we used two tools right now. One of them is just focus on the discipline of market leadership. So in a company, you could be leading with the product leadership, customer intimacy, or operational excellence, but operational excellence only. So any idea that you have for product leadership or any idea that you have how to heighten customer intimacy, those are great ideas. We're going to put them, they're not going to get the forefront right now. Right now, how we improve operational excellence for now, it has an idea to the values and requires no extra resources, and is going to help us increase performance and design to increase our performance, then they can do it. They can go out and do it, and they have the charter to make a mistake. So in other words, what we try to do, the leadership challenge right now is, how do we teach others not to have remorse? It's not easy when you have like a large organization that others identify with this idea that mistakes are okay, that if we're going to be nimble, if we're going to make changes, you have to be able to make mistakes. We try to tell them these are the mistakes we want to experiment with, and what's outside of this box of bounded freedom, that doesn't work for us right now, and we'll explore that at a later time. It's more about deferring. But from week to week, you can see people not bound by the box, but actually having a lot of fun within it, and taking this as an opportunity to be very, very creative and to kind of like reap the opportunities that are there. And it's a great moment also if you see it that way. So I think we've seen a good degree of success. It's a learning process. We're getting better at it. I wanted to ask you though, so also we didn't necessarily mention this in the beginning, but I've seen some of the attendees have done so. There is a box on the bottom, which is the Q&A box. You can click it, and then you can ask a question. Whatever comes up in the chat, we can see. It's a different format of Zoom. So you go into Q&A and you post a question. We have time for that. But I wanted to ask both of you, I know, when we look at values, I know that values don't change over the course of one's life, but do you think something as big as this crisis could be a reason why somebody's own values would change?
Yeah, I think you set up that observation in a really stimulating way, John. And I agree with the premise that our values are quite stable through the course of our life. There is some evidence that a radical shock to your system can result in a change in values. And I guess we'll all have to decide for ourselves whether this is going to be that radical of a shock. My own prediction might be not. I've got a feeling that we're going to be the same types of people after this, but I don't claim any kind of foresight about that. But I would say that it's important to realize that values have some flexibility to them. I think that's one of the reasons why they're so useful. And for example, I was really taken by your own description about the role of family leading in the crisis. And I think we can realize how our values map on to our work, our organizations, our roles in those organizations. And we can also learn about opportunities, or at least get hungry for new ways to pursue our values. So my own take is probably that we won't be different people in terms of our values of these after this experience, but I think we could be very different in terms of how we choose to pursue those values, and maybe even how much energy that we apply to them. My own prediction would be that probably we're going to get more value-driven pursuit, more people saying, look, I've got to do the things that are consistent with my values after we get this experience, which gives us the chance to think about what matters most to us.
Yeah, I'll both agree and disagree with Paul, and I'll agree with him, which I think that the values might actually become more important in a crisis because they're going to focus on what really matters. But I do think that values change tremendously as we go through experience. I'll just give my own example. When I got married and became a father, and I have a 2-year-old and a 3-year-old, and I got married, and all this happened within the last basically four and a half years, right? So, there's something about changes in life experiences that change our priorities, and that's really natural to occur. But I also want to stress something else that I think is incredibly and critically important, which is the values that leaders display have an incredible effect on other people. And I think that, we can create values of generosity of spirit, and we can, through our own behavior, we can, create opportunities to expand the pie, right? So David Brooks wrote, he said, in a crisis, compassion disappears recently. I don't actually think that's true. I think it could be true, but it all depends on what are the leaders signaling that are tapping into those different potential values that will exist within us. So leadership is incredibly important because it's also affecting what that values hierarchy is going to be today and tomorrow.
Thanks, Adam. I have a question from Sasanka, who's asking, there are moral issues that come from the forefront whilst leading during this crisis, trying to drive performance and growth against the backdrop of trying to protect teams physically as well as psychologically, especially in our labor-intensive manufacturing business. Any advice, please, on how one could cope?
I'll just go really quickly there. I've thought a lot about this thing. It's not something I created. It's an old moral idea that goes back, all the way to Plato and Kant. But this idea that there is a distinction between what you might call principles and preferences, or principles and politics, right? This idea that are we driven by principles, or are we just driven by what benefits ourselves, essentially? And I think that one of the things that's so important in a situation like this is to try to find finding the right balance between these two different forces, which is doing what the company needs to do essentially in a situation like this, right? The company needs to keep their supply chain going, keep things, going forward, but they need to also protect the people that are along the way. And I think that it becomes really important that we kind of pair those two concepts together, right? Productivity and safety. We're going to keep going, but we're going to be safe, right? We're never going to mention productivity without safety, without emphasizing the safety. And one of the things that I've really interested in my book, Friend and Foe, I talk about finding the right balance in between competing forces in lots of different ways: cooperation, competition, right? Self-interest and other interests, or, just some examples. But one of the ways that we can do that is we can take these diametrically opposed principles and pair them together in lots of different ways. ways. And this is what great cultures do, right? It's like, how can, Google has been, how can you have a job but still have fun, right? It's sort of the idea of being a Googler, right? And so taking these things that seem disparate and connecting them together. And so that's what I think is really important here.
Thanks. I agree with that. And I think what I would add, I take Adam's point really being about a kind of investigation and a balance of these different important ends. I think that sometimes leaders are tempted by the circumstance of the crisis away from that balance. But I think it's really important to discipline ourselves. I've got a pet peeve that has struck me. It's a personal one, but I've heard so many leaders, as I know you have, say during this crisis, well, safety of our constituents or employees, well, this is the number one criteria. Sometimes they have constituents that don't particularly seem to be at risk of physical safety. And often they're organizations that didn't prioritize safety before. I've got one organization in mind, which I've seen is making trade-offs that sub-optimize on the safety of some of their stakeholders, but now safety would be the only thing that matters. And I would just say about the importance of doing that kind of balance. I'll tell you about an observation I had doing some casework with a fire department in a major city. And I heard a debate between a chief, someone very senior in that organization, and an important leader who was not quite at that level. And that leader had said, well, faced with risk, the number one priority is the safety of the firefighters. And the chief corrected that leader and said, no, the safety of the firefighters is not the number one priority. It is really important, and it goes into our strategy and our optimization. But if it was our number one pursuit, we would never go into a burning building, right? So I think Adam's advice that you have to engage this difficult balance, think about what really matters to your stakeholders on all of them, I think is, is what leaders have to do at this moment.
Yep. Yeah. Derek is asking you guys, there seems to be a global collaborative process emerging, combining public and private and academic actors to address the scientific dimension of COVID-19. Do you think these could lead to new types of collaborative leadership models going forward?
Maybe. I think that, there's, three things to note about this particular crisis. One is that, we want to find meaning and purpose in the world, right? And whoever contributes to a major solution is going to be represented as a hero. I think the second thing is, I don't think there's going to be a lot of profit in some of these solutions, right? Because let's say just take the vaccine, there's going to be so much pressure to produce that vaccine so it's free to individuals, right? You might get some profit from, governments buying it. And so I think it's a really unique opportunity for people to be like, I want meaning in the world. I want to be a contributor and have an impact. This is the way that I can do that. And this is going to be spectacular, for the world. And even if I don't get credit, I'll know that I contributed, but we're not fighting over market share in the same way that we will be. I think it can become a potential, but I wouldn't put too much stock into, what's going to happen is, there's, all these examples of like companies that are collaborating now that as soon as this is over, they're going to go back tooth and nail at each other.
Well, I think that'll happen, but I don't think that that's necessarily inconsistent with the kind of opportunity that Derek identified. I would see the potential this way, that it seems to me with a problem as complex as the one and the set of problems that we're facing right now, that the inputs are going to have to come from all those institutions that Derek mentioned. There's going to have to be a role for companies, for science and research, and for government. So I think that the hope is that we can, if we do that right, and I think to the extent we have any successes, and we will in different parts of the world at different times, it's going to involve the set of those actors. I'm hoping that we could generate a little bit of optimism, and maybe that'll give us and empathy, and that'll give us some goodwill that might help for some interactions in the future. At the same time, Adam's coming from a position that the relationship between those institutions is long-standing and structural. Yeah. And there's going to be some persistence in it, no doubt about that.
I'll just say one last thing. I used the word architect before, and I think that the way that we can keep this going is if we create these structures and these channels that allow that to continue. And I think that's the key thing. Don't let those channels just basically disintegrate afterwards.
Yeah. Um,
Sorry,
Paulina wants to know, she's in the process of, Paulina is launching a product right now, and she wants to promote it on social media, but she doesn't want to come off as heartless. She feels uncomfortable promoting products at this moment. Is there any way to navigate a launch in a way that's sensitive to the situation? Could you hear?
Mostly got it. Yeah, I got the idea of like, don't be, how do you still do business without seeming heartless, especially when you're launching something new? And it seems like, is this really the time to launch something new? And I think that there's, three things to say about that. The first thing that I would say about that is does it have to be now, right? Really ask yourself that hard question. Does it have to be now? And if it does have to be now, that's fine, but you just know that you're making that choice, right, rather than delaying. And then the second thing is, if it's going to be now, is it actually something that will help people during this environment, right? I saw an earlier question was about, physical, it's not social distancing, it's physical distancing. That's exactly right. We want to maintain social connection while physically distancing from each other. And could this be something that would allow people to maintain that social connection? And then the third thing I would say is, sometimes honesty actually really works. Just to be like, hey, I'm really excited. I've worked for 10 years launching this product. We're launching now. I realize it might not be, the right time, but here's why I'm doing it now, right? And letting people know this is the reason why you're doing what you're doing. And I think those things really matter. But I would take a step back and ask, do you have to do it today? Or is it, even 2 months later, is that going to be better?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's something I think we're all thinking about. Like, should we put everything on hold, or how do we operate within what's happening now? Wooter is asking us, he's noticed that social distancing in reality means physical distance, but more social connectedness with family, friends, and colleagues. And he's asking, he wanted to know if I saw that at Applicaster. And then he also wanted to ask, how do you suggest starting a low barrier discussion with colleagues around how to stay true to your values in a work from home environment, which for many seems to be lacking currently? Sure, I'll just say, I think definitely at Applicaster we see some of that, but I think it's not all great. I think that we do yearn face-to-face connection. A lot is lacking over these digital tools. They're good, but they're not great. And even though we might have a little bit more time, just think about the academic experience. I think this does not replace by any means what we had before. So I would say we're coping with it, but I don't think we're necessarily more connected now than before. We're keeping it up.
And I think, one thing that's true is that certain things are lacking now. So Paul said, I sat down this morning. I was really surprised how much I value creativity. And I've been craving creativity. I've been with my 2 and 3-year-old, and I want adult creativity, not 2 and 3-year-old creativity. So part of what we are as human beings is that we crave the things that we're currently lacking. And so some of those things are lacking, are that ability to be an adult and have those same experiences.
Yeah, and I'd like to pick up on the part of Wouter's question about setting a stage for a discussion of values. And here, I'd like to point to the significance of the leader, and no matter what position you are in your organization, you've got the chance to be a leader, but the importance of the leader leading by example. Right? And here, I think when it comes to any kind of important conversation, the leader demonstrating for example, the significance of values will have an impact on the people that are part of the team or organization. So during this crisis, a leader that I do some work with actually ended up sharing with his whole organization a really poignant story about his own family history. And actually it was relevant because it actually was about the experience of his family during the flu outbreak in 1919 and how it had impacted the whole history of that family. But when the leader shared that, which is really a story about values, the response from the organization was quite overwhelming. And a lot of people use that as an opening to talk about some of the things that matter most. So what I would say is put stock in the opportunity you have to lead by example.
I think that's exactly right. And I just want to say, someone asked that, how do you show actor leadership from a distance, right? And I think that's, really great point. And I think, one of the things to do is to, I talk of being visionary and repeating that. Like, if you're sending out communication, repeat those core values, over and over again. And I think that that's, one of the things that you can do, talk about ways that you are empowering others and delegating and how other people are working together, right? And I think that, just like you would apologize, you can apologize over email, right? You can be quick, you can be open, you can be responsible and commit to that course of change. And I think all of those things are true.
It's great advice. We have a couple more questions, but unfortunately we're out of time. So I want to thank you both for taking the time today and for sharing such important advice. For me, I think it was extremely beneficial. I hope for the others as well. And I hope to see you soon on campus.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, John. I'll look forward to seeing you on campus.